I hope I have enough time. Soul. S-O-U-L. Soul. S-O-L. Guess we'll deal with the S-O-L. S-O-L, shit out of luck. No. Soul, sun. Soul, solitary. Solitary. An individual. Well, what's a soul? A soul is that which holds, which maintains its uniqueness within eternity. Eternity, in theory, could be a place of infinite souls, though it may only contain a large number. For most of us, and definitely for me, the difference between a really large number and infinity, I have no way of making that distinction. Except for in, the vaguest terms. And in the vaguest sensations or cognitions or awarenesses or comprehensions. But speaking of soul S-O-L and soul S-O-U-L, because of that connection between soul S-O-U-L, your, I wouldn't call it spiritual uniqueness, but your eternal uniqueness. In a sense, there's this material world, there's the spiritual world, and the eternal world. That's the way I've preferred thus far to make the distinction, because it's the only distinction I can make that I can use in that as an abstraction to make sense of this world, eternity being essentially the realm of what people normally call Platonic forms. Though I think more rightly they might be called Neoplatonic forms. Though I think Neoplatonic is a misnomer, and it ought be just called Platonusian. Platonusian. Once we became more familiar with saying the word, it would roll more easily off the tongue. Platonusian. Platonusian. For Plotinus. Because Neoplatonic refers to the entire school of Plotinus, including Hypatia, and even Iamblichus's own daughter, one of the most significant histories up until the day of, what's her name? Grace from the Navy? Could it be? But yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit because this image, this animation, accidentally, which I mean both in the modern term of the word accident and also in like the historical philosophical meaning of the word accident, is kind of like a happenstance or a secondary structure. Like as a matter of fact, after the fact, but not quite post hoc. Is that there's this donut-like image showed up within this image. like I said, that's an accident of the construction. However, that donut-like image uh, represents one of the symbols in the, I don't know if you'd call it the hieroglyph of the cartouche of Aten. Aton or Aten. Which some would say don't confuse with Atum, Atom, something like that. But which I would say, well, perhaps we should. But the M versus the N, even though it's a transliteration, if we consider the Aristotelian final cause, if we consider that things that happen after affect that which becomes before, because we associate causality with push. We don't associate causality with pull. Yet, if we examine our own lives, I feel pulled most days. I'm pulled to work. I'm not pushed to work. I'm pulled to work. I'm pulled to the grocery store. I'm pulled home. Because I'm reaching for the future. I don't want to do my dishes tonight. But I'm being pulled by my supper through my dishes because I need to do my dishes so I can make my supper. I'm being pulled by my supper through my dishes. I'm not being pushed from behind to do that. I'm being pulled. There is a future that wishes to come to be through a will informed by a desire, wherever that desire comes from. But I wanted to speak about, the sun disk of Aten, Akhenaten, 18th dynasty Egypt, and Moses, and the Exodus and the Torah. And there's really only a few points I want to make, but and the point has been made, and it's been swatted aside. But now in this day, when you don't have to be an Egyptologist and you don't have to be a classical bookworm to get a lot of information, and I'm not denigrating, like, a bookworm is superior to me. People who used to have to search and seek in other ways, and people used to have to be more smart, more cunning, to seek knowledge. Now it's easier. I guess you could say it requires, there are other skills maybe needed these days. Existing is one thing, excelling is another. I'm just trying to exist and remain myself. But Aten, the sun disk, people call it the sun disk, and people call what happened in the 18th dynasty with Akhenaten and Nefertiti, they call it, a lot of people still call it a heresy. So that line, that narrative, that mindset, that thought form that says Akhenaten was a heretic and squandered the riches of the 18th dynasty. There's still that sentiment today. Documentaries today still come at Akhenaten, who is, who was born as Amenhotep IV, but Akhenaten. As a heretic. Yet, he's also accredited often with being the first monotheist. And it was pretty much right, people split hairs over the timeline of the Bible. Right? When we know, I mean, we call the Torah the 5 books of Moses, more or less. And, I mean, more or less. And thus, everything was written after the fact. So we know that. And we know when Moses says, or when Moses is told, by God that God is Yahweh, or Yahweh or whatever. He tells Moses that that's, what he's known by, but that it was, and that he was the God of Jacob and Abraham, but that they didn't know it. They didn't know that was his name. Yet, when we read those passages, we see that name come up. Well, if the Torah are the books of Moses, then he would have known who that God was and placed those words there. But of course, even all of that is an oral history coming down in a few distinct veins and written down later. And I guess I just want to give, because there's not enough credit given to Egypt in the etymology and the philology of the Old Testament. Certainly not in the Strongs. And everything is given, if it's given any non-Hebrew origin, it's given a Canaanite origin, which presumably would, trace back to the origins of Abraham of Ur, or what have you. And no appreciation is given to the Egyptian heritage. And the fact that it's not just common knowledge that amen comes from amen, that it's denied and believed, is so stupid. Amen. Amenhotep, Amen Ra. Amen shows up in the Bible, amidst Moses, who, my whole gig is that Moses and Akhenaten are essentially the same thing. The 18th dynasty as a whole, the whole thing, but specifically in Akhenaten. And one of my big things with Akhenaten is, essentially Akhenaten is the Moses or Exodus phenomenon. And things line up really well. And people parse details that are vague, while the overall larger picture matches up perfectly. 600,000 fighting men. That was the census that Moses took. 600,000 men able to carry swords, which translates to perhaps 1 million to 1.5 million people, up to 2 million people. We can roughly speculate that at about the time of the 18th dynasty, which was about the time of the Exodus, that would constitute about half of the population of Egypt. And people call Akhenaten the heretic, and essentially what Akhenaten did crumble Egypt. It took it took a couple thousand years for Egypt to climb up, or 1,000, 1,500, couple thousand years for Egypt to climb to the top, and another couple thousand, or not couple thousand, but 1,300 years to fall. But the Aten was no more the sun disk. Aten Ra would be the sun disk. Now, Aten, supposedly, if you look up stuff online, because, Akhenaten, everything else used to be Amen. But Akhenaten changed it to Aten, which is supposedly reaches back to like 11th, 12th dynasty. The story of Sinuhe, or Sinroset, which is, and when it mentions the Aten, it's because Amenemhat merges, with the horizon, Ra, its maker. I've seen it referenced, and I've heard the story, but I haven't actually looked at the hieroglyphs, so I can't say for sure if that's accurate but it seems it is. The Aten was mentioned 11th, 12th dynasty. But that entire story, and then not only that, but he flees to a land where there's this leader, and it's Eminensis, which it doesn't say in the story, but should be son of Amenemhat because of the sis. And there was a land called Ya, which is the name of the moon god, but it's more than that because it has to do with the creation myth. And there's a part of the creation myth where essentially Ra, the sun god, and Ya, the moon goddess, merge as one thing. But yeah, I guess the things I really just wanted to point out is that Amen obviously comes from Amen. If Akhenaten is Moses with uncircumcised lips, Moses says in the Bible, and it's mentioned like a few times in a row, like within one or two verses, and that's the only time it occurs. Uncircumcised lips. And then when we look at the statues of Akhenaten, many of us have seen the bust of that really distinctly figured face of Akhenaten. But there aren't as many photos online of like the entire sculpture. And the bottom half and crazy hips, crazy female hips. So that whole blending of the masculine and the feminine, which is the blending of the Ra and the Ya, the sun and the moon. Ra being the Are, the what you see, the real, what you see. The Ya, the moon, the Ia, what you imagine, what's in the darkness, intuition. So Ra and Ya being married in the mind of God, the sun and the moon, Ya, way, even, the even moon, from dusk to dusk, an esoteric language. Like a day isn't necessarily sunrise to sunrise. Sinuhi, sinuset. Set, from set to set. Esoterically, a day is from sundown to sundown. Ya, even. Moon, even. Solomon, sun and moon. But that marriage of Ra and Yah, that's where the Yah of Yahweh comes from, and Yah of the moon. Also, the Yah, the moon goddess, was often represented as a, perhaps typically female figure with the crescent moon on her head with a disc above it, which was also kind of symbolically gave an allusion to Isis. Now here's another good one. Adonis, Aten, Adonis. If you look at the Adonai in the Bible, which means Lord, so a lot of people talk, oh, Adonai. It can also be sovereign, but it can mean sovereign or it can mean Lord, but it means it kind of in the way that the English word Lord means Lord, like the Lord of the manor. It means the head of the household, the patriarch. That's who you call Lord. That's what Adonai kind of means. It's like Massa. It's not necessarily a good thing. Not necessarily a bad thing. But anyway, Adonai and then Adonis. And then they supposedly both come from the same, I don't know if it's Canaanite or just, I don't know. I can't remember which sect from the Arabian Peninsula, but that Adonis, Adonai, and the word atonement come from the name of, I think it's a Canaanite god. Maybe Phoenician. Maybe some other. And people call it at one mint. But there's no mention of Atun, Aten, which would have come before all of that. And what's super interesting is that when Ovid, which we consider really old, but Ovid is really new compared to Akhenaten, a lot newer. But Ovid in 8 AD or 8 BCE, essentially when Jesus was a little boy, just a couple years after he was sitting on the steps, or a couple years before, thereabouts, Ovid published Metamorphoses, I guess you could say published. And in that, Adonis, it talks about how he tricked his mother somehow into marrying her father. So Adonis tricked his mother into marrying his grandfather. Well, Akhenaten, who was Amenhotep IV, his father was Amenhotep III, and his first famous wife was Queen T. Her daughter, two of her daughters, Iset or Isis, and Sitamon, became his royal wives later. So Aton's potential mother, and especially if we connect that with Joseph as being the daughter of the Pharaoh, who then became the Pharaoh's wife, and then the firstborn was killed, just as Amenhotep III's firstborn died, which put Akhenaten in place. Thutmosis of the 18th dynasty of the great house of Amosa, and also the term pharaoh. Akhenaten was the first one to use that, so both pharaoh and pharisee come from the per of Akhenaten, one of his titles. He had a lot. And it's also sweet that he blended, that his wife was Nefertiti, and he blended her name into his prenomen, which has to do with Yom Kippur. Almost all of the prenomens of the 18th dynasty have Keper, Keperure, Keperura, Kippur, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, at one min, a disk, the eclipse, the sun and the moon, the male and the female, the rational mind including the intuition circumscribed by reason, ration, geometry, math, which itself is also circumscribed by intuition. Yeah!